Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Discourses of the Elders, the Aztec Huehuetlatolli, a first English translation, by Sebastian Purcell, narrated by Gary Tiedemann. Translator's Introduction. This translation has been undertaken and supported by what is perhaps a timely optimism. After too long, professional philosophers in the Anglophone world and the European continent seem to be recognizing the existence of other global traditions of philosophy and what contributions they might make. They have also come to recognize the need, if we are to consider ourselves philosophers and not just apologists for the West, to reflect seriously on what those traditions might have to contribute. Philosophy is a difficult practice, after all, and one reason for this is that it has never been easy for a person to imagine how things could have been otherwise. How, for example, can one carry on a metaphysical inquiry without making use of being, either as a word or even as a notion implied through one's grammar? What would it mean for our moral psychology to take seriously the notion that our mind is distributed through the organs of our body and that they compete to direct our attention and decisions? What would it mean to have a virtue of character that, in optimal circumstances, operated by way of shared agency, that is, in groups? What if practical wisdom is conceived collectively rather than individually? The people whom we call Aztecs understand our circumstances in just the way these questions suggest. They have a metaphysical tradition, but no concept of being. They have a sense of mind, but do not conceive of it as distinct from our body. Moreover, they think of our comprehension and judgment as distributed among the different senses of our body, so that these various centers competed for attention and influence. The Aztecs also have a form of virtue ethics. This is the ethical approach found in Plato and Aristotle, and is taken to deem an action as right when it follows from a virtuous quality of character, such as courage or justice. Unlike that articulation, however, the Aztecs conceive every one of those virtues to function, in the optimal case, by way of shared agency in some capacity. This point was nowhere more accurate than in their understanding of practical wisdom, which they think is best exercised in groups, not by individuals. In opposition to Aristotle's lone phronimos, the practically wise man, they urge that we think of the practically wise group. All these points shift our philosophical imagination. They urge us to reconsider whether the paradigms that Western philosophy has been using, whether for metaphysics, epistemology, moral psychology, or ethical theory, have been informed largely by chance and not careful reflection. It is at least worth considering. Perhaps we are wrong about things, even profoundly wrong. We could try to imagine our way out of this possibility through thought experiments. But is it not more reasonable to look to and reflect on established traditions of philosophy to do this work? If both good philosophical method and reasonable optimism about the existence of human intelligence in other cultures urge the study of Aztec philosophy, then there nevertheless remains a real practical objection to its study. Almost none of it is accessible to anyone who is not already a specialist. Several of the most important texts from this tradition have never been translated into English. Moreover, what works do exist are scattered across many volumes, often difficult to obtain, with a wide range of accuracy in their rendering. Finally, none of the works that exist in translation, in any language, have been rendered with cognizance of philosophical terms, topics, and interests. It is to address this threefold deficiency that I set out to translate these Huehuetlatolli, or Discourses of the Elders, which Friar Andres de Olmos compiled beginning around 1535. A Huehuetlatolli is a genre unique to the Nahuatl-speaking peoples of central Mexico just before Hernán Cortés defeated Tenochtitlan's people in 1521. It consists of discourses, tlatolli, from older persons to younger persons. The Huehuetke were elders. After these long speeches, the younger persons followed with brief replies. It is for this reason that they have been called dialogues, even though they stand at some distance from that idea. For a philosopher, the topics prove crucial, since they concern the final goals of life and how one should live to achieve them. It is, in short, a uniquely ethical genre. By studying this set of discourses, as a result, the outlines of the Aztec ethical landscape come nicely and naturally into view, and they do so in what is likely the most introductory path available. At this point, it is worth noting a nuance about names. The indigenous people in question would have called themselves by their cities of origin, not Aztecs. While this is the most widely recognized designation, it proves peculiar, since it names the indigenous people after their mythical place of origin. It would be as if, rather than referring to the Greeks of classical Western antiquity as Greeks, we call them Olympians, because their myths centered on Mount Olympus. It would be more consistent with our naming practices to call these peoples of Mesoamerica the Nahuas, since they spoke and later wrote in Nahuatl. Nevertheless, even this name, Nahuatl, is largely an artifact of scholarship, since the peoples themselves would have preferred designations such as the Mexica, the Tlaxcalteca, and the like. The present volume is thus conceived as the first philosophical translation of a core set of Nahuatl philosophical documents into any modern language and prepared for the non-specialist. These discourses have not been available to English readers previously, and the listener will need some guideposts before venturing into the work itself, as the Nahuatl view is sufficiently unfamiliar to our own that the non-specialist might easily be overwhelmed. What follows in this introduction is an explanation of the decisions that guided the present translation, the relevant context of the manuscript itself, and an outline of the contents. To begin, it will be helpful to have a sense of the broader Nahuatl philosophy, or at least the dominant strand of that philosophy which is present in these discourses, so that it may then be easier later to explain what aims have guided the present philosophical translation. The listener will also more easily find their way through the texts that follow. Let's begin with the basics. Metaphilosophical points. My picture of Nahuatl philosophy, especially their ethics, is notably different from the accounts put forth by anthropologists and historians, but not without reason. Imagine that humanity is fortunate enough to survive well into the 22nd century, and that two groups of researchers look back on our age to articulate our attitudes toward the environment. The first group is composed of historians and anthropologists who survey all the written statements by environmental advocates, as well as written evidence of the daily practices of regular folk who drove carbon-emitting vehicles to work. These future historians and anthropologists would likely conclude that most of us simply had little concern about environmental pollution, and at best engaged in conservation activities that occasionally amounted to more than virtue signaling. The second group, composed of philosophers, would ignore archaeological testimony about the activities of the population, the geologic evidence of our environmental impact, and other documentary information, focusing instead on our philosophy, the writings of those of us who made explicit philosophical arguments in journals and university press books. There, they would find a lively discussion about the nature of harm wrought by environmental degradation and its paramount significance for humankind, suggesting that contemporary humans cared a great deal about pollution and valued their environment very highly indeed. Both groups of scholars, of course, would be right, given the scope of their disciplinary concerns. But their portraits of our beliefs could not stand at a greater distance from each other. Something similar applies in the case of Nahuatl philosophy. Philosophers aim to articulate the logical connections among various statements and to assess their validity. They do not try in the least to represent the thoughts of the common people. In ancient Greece, for example, Plato and Aristotle advanced views which would have been thought thoroughly bizarre by most Athenians. Plato, in the Republic, infamously has Socrates argue that ideal family arrangements should allow for incidental incest. Aristotle, for example, held that God was the first principle of physical motion. But the unpopularity of such views makes them no less worth studying for the philosopher. Likewise, these discourses would have expressed the views of an elite minority among the Nahuatls, and would probably stand at odds with the views of many commoners. Such focus on non-representative views has implications for terminology. Philosophers infamously contort language into a technical vocabulary suitable for their needs. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus finally gains permission to leave Calypso and build a raft to venture home. In the Greek text, one reads that Odysseus goes to gather hylein, a form of the noun hyle, meaning stuff or materials. In Aristotle's metaphysical philosophy, however, hyle takes on the technical meaning of prime matter. One of the principal wagers of my translation is that something similar may be identified in the philosophical discourses of the Nahuatls. Thus, the philosophical view which follows engages only indirectly with most anthropological and historical treatments of these matters. Just as philosophers do not treat the Greek understanding of pollution, miasma, as a significant topic, so the present account does not treat the historical discussion of tlatzoli, filth, as a significant topic. It is not the burden of historians and anthropologists to do philosophy, so my omission should not be taken as a slight against the scholarly quality and importance of their work. Louise Burkhart's study of Nahuatl ethics is the most widely esteemed historical treatment of the topic in the English language, and justly so. Burkhart presents her study as an analysis of metaphorical tropes, which relate elements from separate semantic domains. Specifically, the study follows the way in which certain terms in the early colonial period, such as tlahtacoli, error, become something else in the adaptations of Christian clergymen, such as a metaphor for sin. Her chapters carefully trace the literal and conceptual translation of these tropes. Among the significant historical implications of her study is that the simple replacement theory of indigenous culture by a European one is mistaken, even in moral contexts. Philosophical ethics begins with the aim of answering a different set of questions, not necessarily those that matter most to historians, but those that matter to the discipline of philosophy. These include the following four clusters. First, did the Nahuatls have a conception of the good life, a life that people should be aiming for as opposed to whatever they do aim for? Second, did they have a criteria for discerning right action? If so, what were they? Third, how did they think of these topics as related to our psychological abilities to act on what we should do? Finally, in what source did their views find a logical home? Did they, for example, think of right actions as the result of God's decree? Or did they instead think of their source in whatever could be reasonably discerned by reflecting on human life and its circumstances? These questions briefly range over the four main areas of ethics as a discipline in philosophy, which concerns the good, the right, moral psychology, and metaethics. My study of the philosophical outlook of the Nahuatl is thus often consistent with Burkhart, but it approaches matters differently. Burkhart observes, for example, that the Nahuatls had no sense of good and evil as one finds them in Christianity. Instead, they focused on terms expressing disorder and decay. Coming up, I focus on the Nahuatls' concern with ordering and arranging, which is a positive expression of the same notion. Likewise, Burkhart argues that the Nahuatls do not have an abstract sense of what would be absolutely good, even when they use quali and yekli. I agree, and yet my translation focuses instead on a sense of the good life that the Nahuatls did articulate, along with something approximating what Western philosophy calls virtue. There is more to be written about the metaphilosophical dimension undergirding a translation of this sort, not only for interdisciplinary purposes, but also because the Nahuatls deserve the honorific status of being classed among the philosophical peoples of history. I hope these points prove sufficient for now, so that we might turn to the contents of that philosophy itself, as best as I understand it. Nahuatl Metaphysics. In his essay on What There Is, W.V.O. Quine writes, "A curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? It can be answered, moreover, in a word, everything, and everyone will accept this answer as true. Nearly the opposite could be written for Nahuatl metaphysics. Nahuatl, properly, has no words at all, much less 3 words that could express the basic problem of ontology. Moreover, the Nahuatls have no term for to be, and no grammatical equivalent to the English copular is. While they do have a metaphysical outlook, the fact of the matter is that our English word ontology derives from the Greek participle on, being. So, in a strictly etymological sense, the Nahuatls have no ontology. Rather than having words, Nahuatl has wordle sentences called nuclear clauses. What are called nouns in the language are nouns only by analogy with Indo-European nouns, since they tend to be translated that way in those languages. Strictly considered, one may write michin, or fish, with the meaning that it is a fish. It is unsurprising, given these points, that the language has no singular copular term, and can get by in sentences without it, even in an implied sense. Linguistics experts have classed Nahuatl not only as an omnipredicative language, but as a paradigmatically omnipredicative language. A first, though inaccurate way to think about this is to say that everything is a verb in Nahuatl. What there is, flows. More accurately, omnipredicativity is a paradigm concept. It holds that to be classed as an omnipredicative language, that language must lack a copular term, for example, is in English, and have a certain number of 10 other properties that individually contribute to the omnipredicative strength of the language. The more of them, the stronger. One example of these additional properties is that the language uses a zero-morph to indicate the third-person singular of verbs, meaning that he, she, and it are not marked by any specific letter, morph, when conjugating the word. The points are technical, but the take-home idea is that Nahuatl exhibits all such characteristics, and so is maximally omnipredicative. This matters philosophically, because while it is true that languages do not constrain thought totally, it is also true that they do make certain modes of approaching the world feel more natural. For the Nahuatls, the world is best and most easily conceived as a process of evolving relationships. In their own terms, the Nahuatls conceive of the basic energy of the universe as teot. All things are made of teot, and yet teot does not exist beyond our world. I am made up of teot. You are made up of teot. Even our excrement is made up of teot. Yet, this basic energy is also held to be divine. Not a personal God like the Christian Jesus Christ, but divine in the sense of worthy of our respect and awe. Also, it is thought to be something sacred. Because teot is everything, and everything is in teot, the universe, our natural world, is divine. For these reasons, the Nahuatls are classified as pantheists, which is the view that holds that all, pan in Greek, is God, theos in Greek. But the discussion so far moves too quickly. To be clear, this area of study is new, and there is not yet any settled consensus among scholars. In my own view, teot is rather too abstract to be taken as the basic sense of reality for the Nahuatls. In a way, there is no basic building block from which other things are built up. While the mind is able to distinguish different features of reality, such as teot, each dimension appears to be incomplete and spills over into the next. Our reality, in fact, is a series of relations, usually doubles, called inamikwan, singular inamik. Some of these doubles take familiar forms, such as male and female, hot and cold, night and day, here and there, left and right, and so on. The Nahuatl also had some unfamiliar pairs, such as the numerals 9 and 13. As I understand the matter, teot is an abstraction of sorts, since what there is turns out to be teot as some coordination of these basic relations. In other language, teot expresses itself in doubles, so that he-she is always ome teot, because ome means two. Mostly literally, ome teot means the dual divine. This view has some direct support in existing texts, yet even if it proves slender and contestable, it is also consistent with some of the more common names for ome teot, and so enjoys an explanatory adequacy that rival views do not enjoy. For example, one name is Troque Nawake, which means the Lord of the near and the nigh. To explain, you can think of it this way. Since God is everything, then God is omnipresent, and so always near, always nigh. Yet this God is also called Ipalnemoani, often translated as life-giver. More literally, it is the one by whom we live. That name indicates a true property, for if God is nature, by what else could we live? Finally, this God is described as Yowali Ehekat, the night and wind. This might be plausibly thought to designate an omnipresent God, because one can hardly see at night, cannot notice the wind directly. Understood in this way, ome teot is that God that we hardly know at all, and only indirectly. Ome teot, as the fundamental energy of the cosmos, thus expresses as doubles. These doubles, moreover, are related to each other in an holistic way. All are connected to each other. The whole that expresses that relationship is called, in the Nahuatl metaphorical language, a sun. Following the tale that has come to be known as the Legend of the Suns, they held that there were 4 such previous formations, and that the humans who existed in them were of a different character, so that they even had different foods for sustenance. We presently live in the 5th sun, called Nahuatl, or 4 movement. The kind of movement at work, however, is a specific form of undulating and wave-like movement, which is why legends held that our sun would collapse in a great earthquake. For the Nahuatl, what there is, what exists at present, is thus ome teot, as 4 olin, but ome teot appears to designate all possible suns. In that sense, ome teot expresses most closely what we call being, while the 5th sun most closely approximates what we might call existence. The possibility of the sun's collapse sets a basic existential and broadly ethical task for Nahuatl peoples. Fight. Fight to keep this sun alive. The task is broadly ethical, since even though the Nahuatl held that our sun would collapse, they also thought there was meaning to be had, and something beautiful to be won in this struggle against the forces of entropy that we cannot defeat. The character of this struggle did sometimes entail warfare, which involved the notorious public executions that the Spaniards exaggerated and called sacrifices. But the far more central goal was to order and arrange. Ordering and arranging. In a recorded speech, part of the Discourses of the Elders sequence that is recorded in Volume 6 of the Florentine Codex, our largest surviving selection of the Nahuatl worldview, a newly installed king speaks to the people of his city and articulates the ideal person, both for men and for women. The image is nearly the same one, so I will quote the one that speaks of the man, which makes the point at issue most succinctly. The king describes him this way: "And he is revered. In truth, he is known as a sustainer. He becomes the great Ceiba, the Montezuma cypress, next to and by which people take refuge." There are 2 separate trees discussed in this passage, the silk cottonwood, and the Montezuma cypress, also called the ahuehuete, Spanish. In Nahuatl, the term is ahuehuetl. If you have ever witnessed these majestic trees, you will have noticed not only their size, but also their great root structure, which keeps them firmly placed on the earth. They form, unsurprisingly, part of the Nahua's metaphorical constellation of terms and images that express the good life. I have called this general ideal the rooted life, since metaphors for it include strong trees, standing on one's feet, and living the truth. The last of these metaphorical terms, neltilistli, is literally verification-ness, but it may be connected etymologically to the term for root, nelwayot. If that were right, then the true life and the rooted life are linked etymologically, and the whole constellation makes sense. Nonetheless, it seems unlikely to me that definitive linguistic evidence will emerge on this last point, so I think it more accurate to hold that rootedness is an apt term in English to designate the metaphorical constellation of notions at work in Nahua philosophy that cover the good life. The problem is a cultural one. The Nahuas, especially for their important terms, often refused to make use of just one word or phrase. They preferred many for the reasons I will soon articulate on Nahua aesthetics. So, I am using rootedness here to cover the whole constellation of metaphors as a kind of shorthand, something not very Nahua, but that we have come to expect in the West. The way that one performs this rooted life is to live with excellence or virtue. In Nahuatl, there is a phrase that expresses this notion, inquali inyectli. Such excellent action is performed at the personal level by ordering and arranging the principal features of one's character. The Nahuas used another expression to discuss character in this way. They called it one's face and heart, ixtli yolot. Those were thought to be the seat of one's judgment and the seat of one's desires, respectively. With respect to one's personal character, then, the virtues are just the excellent arranging and ordering of one's face and heart. Yet, the Nahuas are unique in their approach to the virtues. Just as they conceive of reality as a process of relationships, so also do they understand human agency primarily by way of shared agency. Our virtues, they think, are enacted with others in the ideal case, especially for deliberative purposes. Practical wisdom, in short, is a feature of wise groups, and not only of individual agents. One of the primary ways that these wise groups enacted this practical wisdom was through rituals. Rituals are, for us, rather arcane practices. I was raised Catholic and had 12 years of Catholic education. Even after all my time studying the Nahuas, my immediate sense of a ritual concerns practices such as standing, sitting, kneeling, and taking communion. For the Nahuas, rituals were far broader and often much looser in scope. They concerned everything from the observance of the calendrical feasts to the daily routines of youths in school. We don't tend to think of morning routines as a ritual, but with only slight modification, the Nahuas might have. Above all, rituals allowed the Nahuas to coordinate their activities together in an ordered and arranged way. As an example, consider the exercise of practical wisdom when merchants deliberated before departure to foreign cities. The description that follows is from the Florentine Codex, which devotes an entire volume to the merchant class. The ritual observed began by consulting with a day reader, a soothsayer, who would undertake an activity to determine which day was most propitious for departure. The night before departure, a ritual sacrifice, of small animals most likely, would be performed to secure good fortune. Finally, on the morning of the departure date, the leader of the merchant group hosted the leaders of the local neighborhoods, the calpoltin, singular calpoli, to deliberate about the practical conditions of travel. He welcomed them, and they replied in kind. The text reads as follows: "And when he, the host, had thus spoken to them, then the principal merchants of all the neighborhoods, the leaders of each calpoli, responded to his words. When in the case that the host had means and invited guests, then they sat in order by rank. At one side, by the wall on the right, were the principal merchants, and on the other side, starting on the left, sat...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?